When you think about things like white balance and exposure, you're probably used to hearing that if you shoot in RAW, you can easily adjust these things in post. And while that is true, a simple move of a slider can indeed adjust these settings. Have you ever wondered if there's any difference between getting it spot on in camera versus adjusting it in post? In this video, I'm going to compare images side by side, one where I get it right in camera and the other where the settings are off in camera and I adjust them in Lightroom to match the in-camera images. Now the white balance is straightforward. I'm going to adjust the white balance. For exposure, I'm going to utilize both shutter speed and ISO to get it right in camera, and then utilize the exposure slider in Lightroom to match those images. So let's get to it. So if we compare this first image, and let me just say, just to show the settings, just in case you care about that, we're shooting at f2.8, a 15th of a second at base ISO 100. So if we do this first comparison, essentially I shot this with a shutter speed of a 30th of a second. So it was one stop underexposed, and then I brought the exposure slider up one stop in post. So if we compare these two, they are very comparable. The exposure looks spot on. The colors are about the same. In terms of noise from bringing up that one stop in post, it's very negligible. I'm not sure if you can see it on the video, but in person, I would say that there is a slight amount of noise additional in the image on the right where I increased the exposure in post. But nothing that if you were just looking at this image in general, you would see. You may be able to see it better in this area right here. There's definitely a little bit more noise. But if you weren't pixel peeping and you were just looking at this image as a whole in this platform right here, it's negligible. You wouldn't really see it. Okay, so let's move on to comparing the images that were two stops underexposed. So now if we come in here and we zoom in, now you're going to start to see that we are increasing that noise. You can really start to see it here in the shadow side of the face, and the highlight part of the face, it's really not bad. I can see it a little more on my screen here in the eye area right here. I don't know if you can see that in the video, but in the highlighted parts, you really don't notice it as much, but you do see it in the shadows. And that is very typical when you increase exposure in post. You're going to see that noise first in those shadows, and the deeper those shadows, the more noise you're going to see. So that's pretty typical and what you can expect. So this is no exception. So this is two stops under and then brought up two stops exposure slider in post. So again, yeah, you can see that that noise is increasing. But if you were in a situation where 15th of a second was too slow and you need to be a little bit faster, I think if you had to shoot faster and then bring up that exposure a couple stops in post, you are going to notice some noise, but I think it's still usable. Now, if we compare a 3-stop exposure lift, so on this image here, I was shooting at 1/25th of a second. So it was 3 stops under from the base image. Now this is where you're going to start to see some significant noise. So you're going to essentially have some color shifting. You're obviously going to have sharpness is going to be decreased. You are going to have some impacts of shooting. Now, when you look at this image far away like this, it's actually not bad, and you probably wouldn't be able to notice too much if this was an image where the subject was this small in the frame. But if you were shooting an image where the subject filled the frame, you would definitely notice that noise, and it would decrease the appearance of the sharpness. There is going to be that noise there. But again, it's one of those things to where if you have to have the shutter speed that you have to have, then that becomes the priority, and you just have to deal with this noise in post. That's just the way it goes, and that's the way all of these things work. You're going to be in situations where there's a certain setting that you really have to set that based off of the conditions or what it is you're trying to do. So you can't try to always get everything right in post, and that's the reason why I wanted to do this, just to look at the impact of what happens when you do these things in post. And it's good to know that, so that way if you're in a situation where you're like, hey, I got to underexpose this by 2 stops and I'll just bring it up in post, you'll understand what your camera can do and the capabilities and what that image is going to look like, so you know how far you can push things. So what we're going to compare now is the image that I increased 1 stop in Lightroom versus the image that I increased the ISO to get the exposure back to where it needed to be in camera. And essentially what we're trying to look at here is noise. We're trying to see, is there more noise in increasing it in post, or is there more noise in increasing the ISO in camera? Or is the noise patterns and the amount of noise comparable? That is what we're looking at in these next 3 images. So on the left, this image was shot 1 stop underexposed, and then the exposure slider was raised 1 stop in post. Whereas the image on the right was shot 1 stop underexposed from the shutter speeds perspective, but then I increased the ISO, I doubled the ISO in camera to bring that exposure back up to where it needed to be. So if we compare these two, I would say the image on the right where I increased the ISO in post is slightly more clean than the image on the left where I raised that exposure slider. So I'm going to try to come down here to see if it's a little bit more noticeable. I don't know if you can notice it in the video, but the left image, the one where I raised that exposure slider in post, it is there is more noise. Nothing to where it would be a big deal. So if you were only going to be raising it 1 stop or less in post, I don't think it would matter too much. If you wanted the absolute cleanest image, I would still say increase your ISO in camera. But if you were just raising it a stop or less in post, I think that's pretty negligible, especially if you're not pixel peeping. I don't think it would be that bad. But if we compare the image where I was underexposed 2 stops and then raised 2 stops in Lightroom versus increasing the ISO 2 stops, this is where I think even in this video, you're really going to start to see that increasing that exposure 2 times in Lightroom has yielded a significant amount of noise over what you would see by just increasing the ISO in camera. If you look at the shadow areas over here, there is definitely a lot more noise on this image than there is on this one where I increased the ISO in camera. And if we come down here to the table area, you can really start to see, if you look here, this still looks relatively clean to being shot at ISO 400 versus when we come over here, there's a significant more noise over here than what we're seeing in this image. And if we come over here, if I come over here to these shadows right here, you can really see there's a lot of color noise over here, and just overall there's more noise in the image where I increased that exposure 2 stops versus the image where I simply raised the ISO in camera. And so if we look at the 3 stops under, this is really going to drive that home, and you're really going to start to see where there is just a significant amount of noise that gets introduced by raising that exposure 3 stops in Lightroom versus just raising your ISO in camera. So this image on the right was shot at ISO 800. And obviously every camera is going to perform different when it comes to ISO performance. So I was shooting this with the Canon 6D2, which is decent at low light and noise and that sort of thing, but far from the best in the Canon lineup. So depending upon the camera that you have, you're going to get better or worse performance in doing this. But I think overall the performance and what I'm seeing with this is going to be the typical type of situations that you would get regardless of what camera you were using. If I come down here to the table area here, this is where you really can see that there is just a significant amount of color noise and noise in general on this image where we raise that exposure versus the image that I increased the ISO. So there you have that. I think if you're in a situation where your shutter speed needs to be what it needs to be and it's underexposing your image, you are better off in increasing your ISO to get that exposure to where you need it to be than relying on post to increase that exposure. You're gonna have more noise and increasing that exposure. So now we're gonna move on to white balance. And this is one that I really wanted to know if it made a difference, because we all the time hear that, you know, set your camera to auto white balance. It doesn't matter, you can change it in post. And I really want to see if there's just any color shifting or any type of difference between setting that white balance in camera and changing it in post. Now, you may argue you're shooting in RAW, so of course there's no difference. But that's not necessarily the case. We're shooting in RAW, and then I use Lightroom, so I'm using Lightroom to read that RAW file. Every application may read that data differently. It may interpret that data differently. It may apply its effects and its settings to that RAW data differently. So just because we're shooting in RAW doesn't inherently mean that every application, every software is going to treat that RAW data the same. So I really wanted to see if there was any difference, and that's what we're going to compare in these next images. So we're going to start with this base image here, and on this one I had the camera set to auto white balance, and it deemed that white balance to be 4200 on the temp and a +7 on the tint. So for these next two images, I essentially will use those settings to get that white balance back to being the same. So what I did was I took one image that was very cool. I intentionally cooled it. And then I took another image where the image was very warm. So let's compare the base image to the image that was really cool. First, if we zoom in, they look pretty close. I really don't see any differences. I think the colors look the same. The tint looks the same. Everywhere where I've looked at this image, I wouldn't be able to tell you. If I didn't know, I wouldn't be able to tell you which one was set in camera and which one was changed in post. So for a really cool image, it seems to be exactly the same. And if we look at the image where it was really warm and we look at this one, I saw the same results, especially when you look at areas of lighter color. So if we look at the white wall here, and we look at these areas where it's a little bit lighter, we come here, look at the highlights, come over here. To me, it all looks exactly the same. I don't see any difference in color. I see no differences whatsoever. So I would say it's a good thing to know from a white balance perspective. It does, at least for Lightroom and Canon RAW files, there seems to be no difference whatsoever. So whether you get it right in camera or you change it in post, there's going to be no discernible differences between the two. So there you have it. Hopefully this video was helpful. If you like this video and you like my content, go ahead and subscribe, hit that notification bell, and leave me a thumbs up on this video. It really does help the channel. As always, I appreciate you watching this video, and until the next one, take care.